Hey, Joe Gilder here. Welcome to part 3 in this series on how to switch to Studio One. We're going to talk specifically about mixing. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts in this series, I encourage you to watch them. I tell you a little bit about my story of switching to Studio One, which was like a decade ago. And we're going through some of the things I think you got to know to help get you along in your journey of like just crushing it and making lots of great music in Studio One. So mixing is a big part of the music production process. It's probably the thing you're going to use first when you use Studio One. Maybe you got some tracks, you just drop them in and get to know the lay of the land. Let me help you and show you a few things that you need to know. So here's Studio One. Let me open up a blank session. So I'm going to come under just new song. I didn't even give it a name. That's how focused I am. So a blank session, and I've got these tracks. These are actually tracks from another PreSonus person. This is actually from Dave, the guy who developed the whole back end for the Studio One Pro Plus members area. Anyway, fantastic musician. I've got his tracks here. So I'm going to drag these tracks into this blank session and let go. And I've got a setting turned on. I recommend you turn on this setting as well. Let me find it real quick. This one. So come into your preferences, go to locations, which has to do with like hard drives. Under user data, select this box that says ask to copy external files when saving a document. That means these files I just copied over, let's say they're in my downloads folder. And let's say I drag them in and start mixing. By default, the way Studio One works, if that box isn't selected, is it's now looking in the downloads folder to play those tracks back. It's a way of keeping the file size small if you don't want to always copy files from one location to another. I like to copy files from one location to another because I like to empty my downloads folder because that sucker gets full and fills up my hard drive. And if I were to do that without copying those files into my Studio One song folder, I'd be in trouble. So I have this selected. So the first time I hit save after importing, it says, hey, you want to copy all these files? And I say, sure do. And it obviously copies them into the Studio One folder. If you're curious what that looks like, let me open up a folder here so you can see. These are, like, for example, this is the Studio One folder. The name of the song also matches the name of the folder. And then, hang on, this is not moving around. And then inside of that, as you create things, it creates these extra folders, one of which is the media folder, which is where all the audio goes. The cache and history you don't have to worry about. But it's all there, and you can access it all. And you can actually tell Studio One where to put these things by default. And under that preference I just showed you, that window, there's a place that says, where do we kind of default to put our data? It defaults to just your documents folder on your system, but you could set this to an external drive if you wanted. But yes, now we've got the files here. And so that's all well and good. If we press F3, we'll open up the mixer and we will see that all the files are there as well, all the audio files. I'm going to clean things up a little bit. So this instrument section, I don't need that. That's for like virtual instruments. This channel list is nifty, but I don't need to see that either. And I'm going to clean things up as well. The right-hand side is where I keep my plugins open. F7 opens and closes that window. And it does push the master fader over, so you can always see that, which is handy. But let's talk about the actual mixer itself before we start kind of organizing the files. You can adjust the size of it up and down as much as you want to have the exact size that you want for this mixer. If you open it up and you notice like the send section is missing, it's likely because things got small, and as you expanded it out, it's just kind of hiding here. So you just hover your mouse there and just pull it up, and now you have your sends section. So it's typical what you would expect out of a DAW. Your inserts, your plugins go here. This is where your sends go, and then here is the channel itself. This is how you choose your inputs for a channel. This is how you choose your outputs. Here's your panner, which, by the way, if you this is a mono panner. Let me find a stereo one to show you something real quick. On, let's say, this Rhodes channel, there's a little pull down on the panning area. This allows us to change how this panner works. So by default, it works this way, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, when I pan this all the way left, I'm just hearing the left channel. When I pan it right, I'm hearing the right channel, right? Because it's a stereo file, I'm just kind of balancing between the left and the right by default. However, we can change this to a dual panner. Now I have a separate panner for the left channel and the right channel. So if I click like this, I can move the left channel to like here and the right channel all the way to the right. I guess I could move the right all the way to the left. That'd be, yeah, now it's backwards. And I can adjust the width exactly to my taste. So if I wanted, let's say, to pan them both to the right, I could do that. So now both left channel and right channel are in the right, which is helpful for like a piano. If most of the low end is in the left channel, but you want the whole piano to the right, but you don't want to lose the low end, this would be a way to do that. The other mode is this binaural version, which allows you to just adjust the overall panning location with a single panner, but then you can adjust the width here by just typing in a percentage. I believe you can click and drag it as well. Yeah. So you can go 200, which is actually causing some stereo widening to happen. If you command click on anything, which is control click on the PC, in Studio One, it will go back to its default setting. So if you're ever confused, like you got this all over here and this is all down here, and you think I've ruined everything, you haven't ruined everything. Just command click the parameter, it'll go back to its default. Command click, boink, command click, boink. Same with the faders, you got this down here, command click, boink, back to 0. Lovely. This is a little short down here for my faders, so I want to click and make this a little taller. You can make them stupid tall if you want, but this is about what feels right for me. Maybe not so much of a send section, and maybe bring the overall top down as well. That feels pretty good for me. As I mentioned in the first video, we can pop this out into its own window, and it always jumps to another monitor. Hang on. Which we could put on a second monitor if we want. F3 still opens and closes it, but I like to keep it right here within Studio One, within this one window. And it just opens and closes with the F3 button on my keyboard, or this mix button down here will open and close that. There are a couple of other views for the mixer. This is the view I always use, 99.8% of the time. But there are a couple of different views here. One is you can go smush everything down and make it super short. So this has essentially hidden our inserts and our sends. This is great for like a tracking session where you don't really need to see the plugins. You just want to see the faders to adjust levels. But when you want to see those things, you just double click on a channel and they open up to the right of it. And as we press the right arrow, okay, never mind. I thought it opened them each. It does them one at a time. So only the ones we want to be exposed, and if we double click, they go back to being hidden again. That's kind of handy. The other option is if we go back to the tall version and we click this left to right squishiness thing, it makes them very narrow. This is actually even cooler for tracking because now you get these very cool, let me mute the audio, you get these really cool big meters. The normal mode looks like this. You've got the meter next to the fader. This is super handy just to give you a big overview of like where is audio happening. Might be handy when you're doing, say, a static mix and you just really want to have access to faders, the panners, even though they're very small and hard to get to here, and then see the meters happening. I really like this view, and I think if you double click, it will expand. Yeah. So if you got a track, you say, okay, I want to work on this Rhodes track. We could double click and then mess with it here, and then double click to send it back to its narrow view. That's actually, it's kind of neat. I kind of want to maybe experiment with using that more. Like I said, this is the view that I'm predominantly used to using. That one is neat. I'll use this one on like a tracking day when I just want to see the meters, very quick overview of what's happening meter-wise. And then if you go both, if you go narrow and you click this one to make them short, you get this, which is basically took those meters and put them down next to the tiny faders. So it's very compact. It takes up a small amount of screen real estate, which might be helpful depending on what you're doing. But you've got all those options available to you. But again, I like this one the best. And we can still adjust the size of it here. Couple of other buttons down here. You can show your inputs and outputs. So this is something that's different from, let's say, Logic may be like this. It's been a long time since I've used Logic, but Pro Tools doesn't quite have something like this, where I can show the inputs and the outputs. So the inputs, when I click that, they show up over here on the left-hand side. So there's like two different windows. These are my tracks in my session, but then these are my inputs. And these are determined by my I/O setup, which is here. So I'm using a Studio Live mixer, and it has a whopping 64 channels of input, but they don't all show up in Studio One because I don't need them to. I've got it set up to just show me the first 8 or so, or you can customize this however you want. I could say, add another stereo input that's showing me channel 15 and 16, because that's where like my amp modeler is plugged in amp. And so then that would show up as an input in this section. So it's kind of neat. We can only, even though I have 32 analog inputs, 64 total possible inputs. It only shows me the ones that I have set up in my I/O setup. You can see that amp is now set up here. It's just an overview that lets me see the input levels of what I'm recording, what's coming into. So right now you can see we're clipping channels 1 and 2. This, for example, is my voice. My voice is on channel 3 on this mixer. It's not coming into the session, but you can see the level of this microphone here. What's unique about this is, A, it gives me a nice big level meter for setting levels for tracking sessions. So I don't have to, if I didn't want to use one of those other views that I showed you, I could show this view, my input view, which can also be changed using the buttons we showed before. But I can even apply plugins here. So if I apply a plugin here on this input, it is actually applying to the signal before it ever gets recorded. So if input 3 shows up here, and I've got a channel here that's recording from input 3, if I put like a compressor on here, that's going to get recorded. If I put a compressor plugin on this channel over here, that's happening at the mixer. So the audio doesn't get compressed until it goes to the mixer. So the raw audio that gets recorded is not being compressed, but then it's going through a compressor here. So this is just for inputs, just for literally the inputs coming into your system. It doesn't really apply to mixing, but I want to show you because that's one of the buttons that's in the mixer. And then outputs, this may apply to mixing. If you have physical outputs, they will show up here. Again, same thing, the I/O setup. I don't have a lot of outputs because I don't use a lot of outputs. I have my main output and a separate one for click that I sometimes use. Those will show up here. So this is where I could say, all right, I want my click channel to go out channel 17 on my mixer, and I could have that set up here. I could turn the click off on my main and turn it on here, and now I have access. If you're doing something like you're sending things out to hardware, external hardware, this is like a kind of a bus that controls what's going out to that hardware. You don't have to create another bus to do that. You could just say send it out channel 5, but then I could apply a plugin to this if I wanted to before sending it out. Now I rarely have these open. I'll have the input channel open, and one of the tricks I'll do, this is totally not a mixing trick, is I'll put the tuner plugin on the input, and then I'll just have this plugin open. And sometimes I'll pin it so it stays open no matter what. So as I'm playing guitar, if I hit a note, I can just look and see, am I in tune or am I not? There we go. I'm on pitch. Great. That tip is free. Okay. All right. So, and that works whether I have the track armed or not. If I'm recording on different tracks, I don't need 20 different tuner plugins. It's just on my input, which is kind of neat. All right, back to mixing. What are a couple of the core features that you need in a mixer? The first is the ability to add plugins. As I've mentioned many a time, you can add them by clicking here. You can search for the name of the plugin and then choose it. That's fairly quick. The way I tend to do it is I like to have my plugin list open on the right-hand side, and I like to drag things directly to where I want them. So if I want this to go on this deep synth, I can drag it here, and it'll add the plugin, and it'll open the plugin for me. Or I can drag it on top of this existing plugin, and it will replace the one that's there. And then I can also do a few things like I can drag this plugin over. If I just drag and drop, it'll just copy it over. And of course, it opens it because it thinks you want to edit what you just dragged over. If I want to move a plugin, let's say I don't want it here, but I want it here. Right now, if I drag it, it says copy effect, but then cool thing about Studio One, it'll talk to you if you let it. If I hold down Command, it says remove fat channel, so that just deletes it entirely. If I drag it and I hit Option, it says copy the fat channel plus automation. If I had any plugin automation on this particular plugin, it would copy that automation, which is cool. And if I hit Shift, it will move from one to the other. So a lot, I wish that didn't pop up every time. So it moved it from this channel over to here. And if I want to remove something, I can just click and drag, hold Command, it just removes it. Kind of like throwing things away. Of course, you can, if I add a plugin here, an EQ plugin, sorry, it keeps popping up. I can remove plugins also by just right-clicking and then choosing Remove. You'll see me do that a lot. Honestly, that Command, click, and drag is a little quicker. Can you see how that workflow is pretty fast? Another thing, if I have, let's say I want to add an EQ to all these channels, I can select the first channel, hold down Shift, select the last channel, and then drag an EQ on, and it'll add it to every channel. Super simple. Undo works in the mixer. Undo works in the mixer. I don't know if this is true in other systems, but it wasn't last time I used like Pro Tools. But let's say I move this fader and I move this fader and I move this panner. And I think, shoot, I didn't mean to move that. And I don't know which one I moved. I just need to undo that. Undo. You can undo mix moves. Applies to plugin settings too. Super handy in a pinch. Just Command-Z to undo, Control-Z to undo. What if I want to add buses? Let's say we've got these background vocals here. If I want to add them to a bus, I just select them all. I right-click on the channel, and you get all these lovely options that you can explore. I like to add bus channel for selected channels. It automatically creates the bus. Here it is. I can name the bus BGVs, and they're automatically routed and good to go. Everything by default is going out the main output, but now these are routed to the bus. That's how buses work. You also have effects channels, which are essentially the same. If we just right-click, we can choose Add an Effects Channel. An effects channel looks just like a bus channel, except it says effects here, and I've got it set up to where if we click on this little wrench on the left-hand side of the mixer, all my effects channels always go to the far right of my session, but my bus channels do not. You can tell it to do that if you want. If you want all your buses on the right and your effects channels on the right. I've done that in past versions of myself. But I kind of like to keep the effects channels to the right, but keep my buses with the tracks that they're grouped with. Also, this input controls button, I like to start with that on. Ooh, it has a key command now, Shift-I. So if I hit Shift-I, it opens up this section, which gives me a trim knob at the top of every channel and these polarity buttons. That if I click them, they will both go. If I hold down Option, it'll let me just click one at a time. Really quick way for checking phase on drums and things like that. Super, super handy. Now, one of the things I love to use in mixing, you'll see this in all of my videos, is I like to have folders. So let me just create a folder real quickly. I'm just going to right-click down here, add a folder track. And we're going to call this, let's say, guitars. We'll call it EG for guitars. No, we'll call it electrics. Okay? So I've got this folder. There's nothing inside the folder. It's just an empty folder currently. Let's give it a cool color like pink. Now, let's say I want to put all my electric guitars into this folder. But also, I would love for that folder to also correspond to a bus. So what I can do is when I zoom in, this little drop-down menu appears, and I can choose Add Bus Channel. And what it did is it turned this folder into a bus. So now it's double duty. It's a folder and it's a bus. If I come over to my mixer, I will find a bus over here called electrics. Now, why is that important? Because guess what happens next? If I want to drag some electric guitars into this bus, check out what happens. First of all, these are the tracks that I have selected. Let me change them all to white so you can see them real quick. That's not white. There's no white. Okay, this light blue. Currently, these are all this kind of light blue, and they're all routed to the main output by default. But what happens when I drag these into this folder? Two things happen. First of all, they're all changed to the color of the folder, which, by the way, is a setting. If it doesn't do that for you, don't freak out. Just come over to Advanced, and there's a setting called Apply Folder Track Color to Content. Make sure that's selected. I love that setting. So now I don't have to go change the color on things one at a time. I just drag them into the right folder, and they change colors automatically. Also, check it out. These are the tracks I just dragged. They are all now routed to my electrics bus. They're in the electrics folder, and they're routed to the electrics bus. So I changed the color and the routing by where I placed it. By when I dragged it into a folder, it also changed the routing. That, to me, is and continues to be a game changer for me. So now I can adjust the overall volume of the bus here. I can solo the entire bus here. I can record enable the entire bus. I can mute the entire bus. And I can control the volume right here. I can even drag plugins onto the bus itself. Let's say I want to EQ all these guitars together. I can do all that on the bus. I never even had to open the mixer. And if I press F4, it opens up this inspector, which part of that gives me essentially the channel overview for that channel, which includes the fader, all the buttons, plugins, and sends on a per channel basis. And we can just press up and down arrow to go through and cycle through and see all of those. Couple of cool quick commands. Key commands are my friend. They're probably your friend as well, especially if you're coming from a system like Pro Tools. Two for mixing that are super helpful. The letter S. If you have a channel selected and press S, it will now be soloed. Press it again to turn it off. Toggle solo on and off. To mute, same thing. Guess what letter it is? M on the keyboard. Mute, 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 mute. Super, super simple. So if I want to solo this and this. Oh no, I've got a different setting. This is cool. This is a setting. One of the big things you need to know is there are two wrenches inside of Studio One. They're both on the left. One here in the mixer, one here in the arranger. And these give you a bunch of cool options. So it would behoove you to check these out. This selection is called, setting is called solo follows selection. That means I only solo one thing at a time. So once solo is engaged by pressing S, as I move through, it just solos whatever is selected, whether I click it or whether I move it with my keyboard. That's super handy for A-Bing things, switching back and forth, or if I just know I never want to hear more than one thing unless I solo the entire bus, like this, for example. But otherwise, individual things will just jump from one to the next. It's kind of that either or thing. I forget what it's called in other systems. If you turn that off, then it just follows the normal thing. I can just press solo on whatever specific channels that I want. Here's something you should know. This is one of the things I've forgotten this was something in Studio One, but I love it. Let's say I've got a reverb on, I want a reverb on all these guitars. And I want to set it up as a reverb send. So I send the guitars to the reverb. First of all, drag and drop makes that ridiculously easy. I find my reverb. Let's go with the flat plate preset. I drag it into this send section of my guitar bus, and it automatically creates the send and created the return. It created this effects channel called Room Reverb with the appropriate plugin and created the send. So now these guitars are sending to this reverb. And I've got a key command, it's Control 1, adds EQ. I like to EQ my reverbs to keep them from being muddy, usually at like 400. Anyway, that could also be saved as a preset that automatically loads in for me. But what's really cool about this is here's how I adjust the volume going to the send. Here's how I adjust the panning going to that send. Here's how I toggle if it's a pre-fader send or a post-fader send. Each has its own volume. Here's how I turn that send on and off. All of which super handy things to know. But here's what's super cool. I remember years ago when I was in Pro Tools, and maybe they've changed this since, but if I wanted to solo my drums, if I press solo, let's say these guitars, I want to listen to just these guitars, I would have to do either one of two things. Actually, no, I'd have to select all the guitars and then solo them. And if I did that, I'd have to make sure I made this bus solo safe. Otherwise, I wouldn't hear anything. I'd have to open up the bus. And if I came to the bus and I pressed solo on the bus, I wouldn't hear anything. That's dumb because who wants to hear nothing? If I press solo on my guitar bus, it makes sense that I would want to hear everything that's coming into that bus. So what happens? Let's say, first of all, let's say I solo this one guitar. It automatically solos that bus as well because that's where this guitar is feeding. And it opens up my effects. It knows that there's reverb going over here. So when I solo this guitar, it solos everything that the guitar is involved in for me. If I solo the bus itself, it solos everything feeding that bus. That is a super, super, super handy thing that I honestly have forgotten exists. I'm so used to it, but then I'll see other people in other systems and they're doing this number. Well, let's solo these drums. Doink, 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 doink. Or they have to create a group for those drums and then they have to press solo. You don't have to do any of that. You can literally just select what you want to solo and press S and it'll solo. And you can toggle it on and off to your heart's content, or if they're all feeding a specific bus, you can just solo the bus and it'll solo everything feeding those. By the way, what you just saw me do, selecting multiple things and adjusting them, it works for more than just solo. It works for, let me turn off solo for a second. It works for faders. I have not created a group for these. I've just selected them and I'm moving the faders. It works for panning. This, when I've got 1,000 background vocals and I need to pan every other one left and right, check this out. I can select all of these, pan them left, and then I can select the opposite ones. Dude, this is actually a fairly recent development, and I can pan those right. Saved my bacon. Okay, that one didn't go all the way to the right because it was already panned to the left. Anyway, you can do that to multiple things at once. I can adjust the trim knob of multiple channels. I can adjust the polarity flip button for multiple channels. I can obviously do things like add sends and things like that to multiple channels just by selecting them. I'd almost never use the group feature in Studio One, even though it has it. I used it extensively when I was a Pro Tools guy, but now I don't use it all that much because I can just say, I want to turn you guys down. I just select them and turn them down. It's so intuitive and makes so much sense. Also, you'll notice, you may not notice, but if you look here, there are a couple of buttons here on this border between the arranger and the mixer. This one turns on and off all your plugins. So if you quickly want to hear what it sounds like with no plugins, let's say we put a bunch of EQs on here. This lets us turn all those plugins on and off with a single button. Pretty handy. You don't have to know any fancy shortcuts. It's just there for you. Also, whenever you solo something, let's say we solo these 3 tracks, you'll notice this button lights up. This is a global solo button, and it has a key command, Command-Shift-S. I believe that's probably Control-Shift-S on the Mac, on the PC. And then the mute is the same thing with an M. I use this all the time. I actually forget that I do it, so I wanted to make sure that I remembered this time for you. If I've got a set number of things soloed, so like those 6 tracks are soloed. If I want to turn them on and off, I can press S, and that works while they're selected. But if I come over here and I've selected over here something, or I've just selected one of them, but I want to toggle that solo still, how would I do it? Well, I'd have to go reselect everything and press S, or I can use this global solo button. I use the key command. Check it out. It remembers what was soloed, and I can just turn them on and off. Same thing works for mutes. If I've got all these things muted, and then I want to toggle that on and off, even though they're not selected, Shift-Command-M toggles those on and off. It's one of those things you think, okay, that's neat. Once you start using it, you realize, holy shnikes, that is super helpful, because I find myself soloing something and listening, and then going over here and messing with something and being like, okay, did that fix it? Hang on, let me hear that solo again. Boink. I re-solo the things that I had soloed, and it remembers. It just remembers the last one, and it's so delightful. It literally gives me goosebumps. Something as dumb as that, but it makes me happy. And these are the small things that Studio One did for me that made life a lot better. Okay, so I've shown you a lot. Final thing I'll show you is automation inside of Studio One. If you want to automate something, let's say on this sizzle track, we've got a high-pass filter, and we want to automate that to do something like this during a certain section of the song. All we got to do is click the parameter that we want to adjust. Actually, this is even easier. There's a couple ways to do it. If you select a parameter, you'll see it shows up here on the top left. If you click that button, it'll let you automate it, but there's actually an easier way, I think. Just right-click on the parameter and choose Edit Automation. And you'll notice on that channel, that sizzle channel, it changed its view. It now has this horizontal yellow line, which wasn't there before. This is that parameter. So now we can see it's at 150 hertz. So we could set if we hover at the top, we can set the overall thing down to like 20 hertz. We can click to create a new automation point and then just drag this up to like, I don't know, let's go all the way up to like 6K. And then it's automated. We can even change like the shape of the automation if we want to start slow and then get fast, or vice versa. And then we just hit play. We can open up this EQ and we can see, check it out, it's automating. Same thing for faders. If we want to just right click on a fader, edit automation, we can either just move it, right? Click things and move it around, which will work to automate that fader right now. Or we can use traditional automation where we switch it to touch mode. We just hit play and we just start moving this around. And as you can see, the automation is being written. And if we play it back, that fader is now moving haphazardly, but also beautifully. And then we want to put that back into read mode, of course, so we don't mess up our automation. So you can do that with almost any parameter inside of Studio One. And also, did you notice how some of the stock plugins in Studio One have a visual in the mixer? Did you see that? Yeah, that's pretty cool. So we can see what's happening with our EQ, or if we use the stock compressor in Studio One, we can actually see the compressor working. Let me make this bigger. Hold on. Yoink. I can single click on it and it shows me the compressor. I can even like adjust the settings of the compressor inside the mixer. I don't use that part of it very much, but having the visual of what the EQ is doing can be super handy. Look, I'm actually EQing things here. That part's not that handy, but being able to see what's happening there on a global level, super handy. And you can turn each of these on and off as needed. Let's say we want to turn all of these off. What have we learned? We can select them all, and if I just single click, oh, it did it across all of them. Almost all of them. Oh, it deselected when it did that. Need to select them again. Boom. The second row will now be closed, and now the top row is closed. And then I can say, I want these to show me the EQ. I'm just single clicking. And anyway, I nerd out about this stuff, and I like it a whole lot. Final thing, I already said final thing, but this is actually the final thing. On our mix bus here, you'll notice this thing called Mix Effects. Depending on what version of Studio One you have, you'll see one or more things show up here. The one that comes with Studio One, I believe, is this one. And if you open it, you'll see it's just seems like a regular plugin, but this is the Mix Effects engine. This is applying the sound of this console across everything. And so all your buses are behaving like buses that have now a drive knob and even a noise knob and even crosstalk between channels. It's a little more advanced. Well, we've got videos on this, but it does exist and it does change the tone. And depending on the version of Studio One you may have access to a couple different consoles that you can access. And it's not a plugin on your mix bus. This is something that's happening across all your channels to add this cool kind of extra level of saturation and warmth and all those other buzz phrases that we use. I like to use that early in my mix to I've got the balances and I set a console that sounds good. Some of them sound brighter, some of them sound darker, and then I just mix with that on. And it happens under the hood without me having to put plugins on every single channel. It happens, there's just one place where I adjust it, and then it happens across my entire mix, which is super handy. And honestly, something we should talk about more, but it's just so handy. I just use it and then I kind of forget that it's there, and it just does all these wonderful things to my audio under the hood. All right, that is an overview of mixing. Even as I'm saying this now, I know there are more things that I could show you, but this really does get you started in using Studio One to mix and then hopefully using it to do everything that you ever would want to do when it comes to music and audio. My name is Joe Gilder. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.